One of the many things I love about the Mario franchise is its strong musical identity. Nearly every single installment has its own main motif, which the composer will riff on and remix. The regular version of this theme plays on like a grassy knoll, and then there's an upbeat sky version and then a frosty snow version with sleigh bells in it. I'm sure you've noticed this. This main melody will also probably pop up in various jingles throughout the game. I think it's fair to say that longtime Mario music man Koji Kondo has perfected this art, having been solely responsible for the sound in a significant chunk of Mario games. He has one work, though, that is so transcendental in its sound design that I don't think it can ever be recreated, let alone topped. That game? Super Mario World. To justify that claim, I want to talk about how we classify audio in games. I feel like you can generally split video game audio into three categories. First and foremost, there's the soundtrack, comprising the longer, looping themes that play in the background. I think this category is the most recognizable type of audio. A game's soundtrack is usually a huge part of its legacy. There's nearly always a load of jingles too, short stings that play in response to an event, say you beat a level or you die. Lastly, there's sound effects. These have a practical purpose. They're diegetic, they're noises which represent the sound caused by a physical action happening in-game. When we think about forms of creative expression in a game, we tend to focus on the first two categories. Throughout its soundtrack and various jingles, Mario World is constantly weaving its main motif in. I've just discussed how Koji Kondo's always doing this, but this game takes the idea further than any other in the series. The main melody is seamlessly incorporated everywhere, even in settings you wouldn't expect to hear it. I love this soundtrack. It perfectly encapsulates and enhances the whimsical attitude this game has. But it's not why I consider Super Mario World to be Koji Kondo's magnum opus. No, Mario World's sound design is legendary because of its use of sound effects. Everything in this game is an instrument, and by that I mean that every action creates a wonderfully peculiar and musical noise. My favourite example of this is the Yoshi voice sound effect. It's an unusual sound, probably because it's actually this orchestral hit sample. Pitch bent. You hear this kind of thing all over Super Mario World. Checkpoints whistle at you. Thwomp impacts are like drums. I don't even know how to describe the feather sound effect, but I love it. Perhaps all of this seems par for the course in a Mario game. That's because Super Mario World is the origin of so many long-lasting sound effects. The decision to make the game sound like this, though, wasn't just an artistic one, it was practical too. Audio on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, was a big step up from its predecessor, the NES, in that it could freely play audio samples on 8 separate channels, rather than just simple waves and tones. Freely play is a little bit misleading, however. The SNES only had 64 kilobytes of audio RAM. This had to hold all of the game's audio samples, as well as the sequencing data telling the system how these samples should be arranged to form music and sound effects. To put that into perspective, that pop sound effect I just used is about 30 kilobytes, so I could fit that like twice into the SNES, and then I'd be out of room. So Koji Kondo did not have much wiggle room, and as the saying goes, limitations breed creativity. Samples used in the soundtrack are craftily repurposed for sound effects, and as a result, the whole world feels full of music. Here's a quote from Koji Kondo himself. The cheap, square wave sound of the Famicom had come to define game music for most people, but the Super Famicom could play a much wider variety of tones and sounds. That being the case, should I try to imitate regular music that we hear all around us, or should I try and use these sounds to create a new style and lexicon of game music? I had to really pause and think here. For Super Mario World, I decided that, for now at least, I would try to use sounds that resembled the normal instruments you hear in the real world. However, my idea was to arrange the individual instruments in a way that you don't normally hear, like putting banjo and steel drum together, for instance. I'm well aware that he's directly referencing the game's soundtrack here, and not the other aspects of the game's sound design, but I don't think it's a huge leap to suggest that this philosophy of utilising instruments in unconventional ways carried over. I think it's a lot easier to appreciate music than it is to appreciate sound effects. After all, when I go out running, I'm not exactly going to stick my headphones on and listen to it. And that got me thinking, how do we, in popular culture, appreciate sound effects as an art form? Then it struck me, they get meme-ified. Sound effects get turned into internet memes. The internet loves recognisable sound bites, and Mario World is no exception. I'm reminded of one of the first videos I ever watched on the internet as a child. I said earlier that I don't think this can ever be recreated. That's because Super Mario World was conceived at a perfect point in history, a point at which game audio had just been freed from the shackles of having to sound like. But also a point at which there were still restrictions that forced creative solutions. And I think it bears mentioning at this point that Koji Kondo is far from the only composer who used the SNES in amazing ways, but that's a topic for another video. The sound design of Super Mario World continues to inform the sound of newer titles too. As I said earlier, it introduced a number of staple sound effects into the Mario canon. Beyond that, Super Mario Bros. Wonder in particular is heavily influenced by Mario World. From the moment you begin playing, you'll hear a familiar technique. Its ground pound sound effect is a drum roll, jumping plays a guitar string. This game went to the Mario World School of Sound Design and graduated with a first-class degree. And this is a purely artistic choice too. It's not as if we're dealing with the hardware constraints of the SNES anymore. Love it. I made my own game last year, blatant plug, I know. And when I was coming up with the soundtrack, with the jingles and the sound effects, the Mario games were a huge source of inspiration. I'm not saying that this kind of musical approach to sound design is always the best practice. I feel like people would be a little bit annoyed if GTA 6 finally came out and whenever you fired a gun it sounded like. But I think it's worth at least being cognizant of it, whether you're making a game or just sitting down to play one. Thanks for watching.